Come all of you good workers, good news to you I'll tell of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Tell me, which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
Welcome to another episode of Red Planet. Today I'm talking to Joe and Janine from the Common Humanity Collective, a mutual aid network who operate in the East Bay area. How are you both doing?
Great, and really excited to be here. Thanks so much for having us.
Oh.
Yeah, it's an honor to be here.
Well, thank you for coming on. It's an honor to have you on. I'm personally very, very excited about what you're doing, about mutual aid networks in general. I haven't actually gotten this written down for our questions today, but maybe like a question 0. If people are watching, they don't know what mutual aid is at all. Do either of you want to tell them?
Yeah,
Sure.
totally. I think one of the definitions that really resonates with me is believing that the people that we're distributing to can actually provide something back to us and not seeing them as helpless.
Yeah.
I think that, we're working to serve a need, and we're also working to build community and build reciprocity within that. And I think a key part of mutual aid is actualizing that reciprocal relationship.
Joe, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I can add to that. CHC, Common Humanity Collective, is a network of hundreds of volunteers, and the products that we build and distribute have made it into the hands of tens of thousands of people. And when I talk about mutual aid, I kind of like to frame it in opposition to nonprofits, charity, philanthropy. Mutual aid is about serving the people, and it's very different from philanthropy. The big nonprofits and the foundations and so on are problematic because they're band-aids. They're not interested in transforming systems.
Right.
As social programs, nonprofits are funded and consequently controlled by the super wealthy. So they make people dependent on capitalists, in contrast to like democratically managed, wholly public services like those of the New Deal era. And beyond that, nonprofits are bound by law and by their donors to stick to these narrow apolitical missions, and to never seriously agitate for systemic change, or else be defunded and dismantled. Mutual aid stands in contrast to that, I think.
Yeah, good answer. I really, really like it. So, on to the actual questions. You said your products. We've talked about how mutual aid works, but what does Common Humanity Collective do, make, and So one thing I guess people talk about. I've seen people talk a lot about a really key distinction for mutual aid is it's about community, and the people who are being helped by it, you are in community together. And so, let's say there's 2 parts to this question. What do you do, and how are you organized?
Sure. I can start this one, and then maybe you can take over, Janine. Common Humanity Collective has produced products. Is such a weird word. I feel kind of awkward saying it, but like,
yeah. Well, what are the things people need that you get them?
yeah. We started at the beginning of the pandemic, and we've produced hand sanitizer, which early on was thought to be very essential in limiting the spread of COVID. And then we produced these high filtration masks, which are assembled by hand. And most recently, we've produced a bunch of DIY air purifiers. Janine, do you want to comment a bit further on this?
Yeah, I so appreciate you talking about community, and I'll mention that quite a bit in the coming questions. I think to me it's a really essential...
brief self-plug, I do a show called Red Planet, and we did an episode on mutual aid versus charity and what the difference is. And that was one of our key takeaways.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely resonate with that. And I think, what Common Humanity Collective does is so much more than just, building things and giving them away, though I think that's an essential part of what we're doing, right? I think the building also separates us from other organizations, being able to kind of actualize and take agency over the means of production for goods that we're making. And I think we have been able to do mutual aid and also politicize people. I've watched, I can think of at least 2 people who, started with Common Humanity Collective being relatively apolitical, and who have since, mostly through doing the work. I know that they've done some readings, but I would say theory has been less behind this than actually just being on the ground and participating in this has been. And I've watched them start to, read more political articles and start sharing those in the Slack, or start, commenting on mutual aid theory in very advanced ways. And that's been really exciting to watch, this politicization of, our community, and also with the people that we're distributing to. I would say our leadership and the way that we're structured is very horizontalist. We don't use Robert's rules. We don't really vote. Generally, we are a small organization, and I think that benefits us in some ways, but we're able to come to consensus. I think, when people realize they're outvoted, they kind of say, okay, we'll go with what the majority want. We kind of talk things out and figure out how to do it collectively. And I think that makes it much more accessible. I think oftentimes highly structured organizations, while there's a place for that, can make things really inaccessible to new people who aren't experienced with those types of formal talking points or hierarchies. And our aim is to continue to be a really horizontalist organization and allow people to come in and take ownership of this work immediately.
Cool. Yeah. That's really, really cool. Joe, did you want to add to that?
No, I think that was amazing.
Oh, yeah, I did. I thought so too. Really good answer. Well, maybe this one's more for you, Joe, then. You've been with CHCs from the beginning, right? So how did the group start? How did it get going, and how did it get to where it is today? Maybe some challenges that you faced along the way. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. So the year is 2020, and pandemic sweeps the globe.
This is the opening crawl to Johnny Mnemonic, I think.
I had just been working on the campaign to elect Bernie Sanders as the Democratic nominee for the presidential election. And I'd been working within our local chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA. And just as it becomes clear that he's not going to win, after we've knocked, thousands of doors and talked to so many people, COVID hits. So it's this really depressing, despondent moment.
Yeah.
And on top of that, the nominee is Joe Biden, who's this neoliberal who wrote this awful, vicious crime bill, who has a long history of, he's opposed to Medicare for all, and it's the biggest public health crisis in 100 years. So a friend of mine calls me up, someone who I befriended during the Bernie campaign, Abrar, and he says he's working on this project. He's come up with a way to manufacture large quantities of hand sanitizer in his lab at UC Berkeley. And I was really excited when he called me because I wanted to do something tangible and respond to this crisis. There's a certain joy, I think, in crises, despite the horror and the pain. There's this line from a Molly Crabapple essay where she says something like, disasters wash away old assumptions, and they reveal scars, and they reveal treasures. And in crises, people always come together and instantly abandon capitalism and help each other. And that's exactly what we saw. Everyone that I called up, friends, coworkers, neighbors, family, was instantly down to help out. And we built out a network to bottle hand sanitizer and run deliveries to hundreds of organizations across the Bay Area and beyond. Not long after that, Chris came into the equation. Chris is another grad student, and he had come up with this really clever mask design. It didn't require sewing. It used a high filtration material. Eventually, we got it formally tested, and it showed very high efficacy, much stronger filtration efficiency than a cloth mask or a surgical mask. So we called it our N85, and our network grew. Ultimately, we've produced over 60,000 reusable submicron face masks, and we've mixed and bottled over 7,000 gallons of hand sanitizer. And it was around here that Janine enters the equation.
Yeah. So I kind of came to Common Humanity Collective through DSA. And as I began to become more integrated into the organization and kind of work on this DSA side of things, Common Humanity Collective up until this point was having people take masks home and kind of kits to make masks in kind of like a putting out system of production. And in the DSA side of things, we really wanted to like build community and politicize our work even more. I think mutual aid is inherently political in itself, and we can talk about that more later. But I think having a place to have people build masks together. And so we were building kits, together in a park outside, a few of us, because it's like peak COVID, winter of 2020, early 2021. And then driving those around to people's homes and getting on Zoom to make masks together. And we were discussing readings and theory in one Zoom room, and in another we had someone teaching new people how to make masks. And we did this in sets of 2, so there was always at least one call that everyone was together talking about theory. We had high schoolers, and we had people who had, read all 3 volumes of Capital, and we had, liberal folks who like didn't really know what socialism was, all in this Zoom room.
So it's like my audience. Great, cool. You got the teenagers, the people who've read Capital, and the liberals. Yeah, great.
Exactly. All in this room, like discussing theory and seemingly being engaged and even staying after the call to hang out together. And one of the things that was so meaningful to me about this experience was, this was an incredibly dark time in so many different ways. And to have people come on the call and say, this is the highlight of my week, this is the highlight of my month, I think you can't underestimate the power of that and the power of building community and giving people a voice and a place where they felt comfortable during a time where nothing felt normal and nothing felt comfortable. And as this mask production started to slow with vaccines, with people not wanting to spend more time on Zoom, and masks being, really high filtration masks being less of a demand, the cost started going down. We were able to produce these masks for 60 cents each when an N95 was about $5. And so with that, we started to transition into a reading group. And also transition into building air purifiers for fire season, which is a huge issue in California.
Right.
People often die from breathing in really toxic smoke around this time. There are a lot of folks with, asthma and respiratory issues where this season is incredibly difficult for them. And so, again, Chris came up with an ingenious way of building a really, really highly effective air purifier. And I had realized during this mass production time that one of the things that was keeping people coming to these calls in a way that I saw a lot of organizations during this time kind of lose people, and we were actually having about 30 people come to our mask calls, which was a pretty good amount, was this sense of community, this sense of camaraderie and comfort.
Right.
And wanted to kind of expand that. I was like, okay, we can do this bigger and we can do this better. And so for the air purifiers, we started this assembly line. And I think this also goes kind of back to what I was saying about, in the early days, we were using this kind of putting out system of people building stuff in their homes. And then we come to make this assembly line, essentially recreating the Industrial Revolution in a very small and tiny scale, where all of a sudden we're collaborating with, 15 different organizations in the Bay Area. And again, right, you have some of these more liberal folks from some organizations next to these more radical folks from other organizations talking to each other and building air purifiers. And we started having like 70 people show up on a Saturday to build air purifiers. And, people continued to hang out afterwards and build connections. And I think, this work was extremely political in multiple ways. I think, building independent and autonomous, like communal, horizontal means of production around really essential goods with a distribution that had, no conditions, is inherently political. And I think also starting to think about dual power and starting to think about creating Common Humanity Collective as this kind of like small potential of what a world could look like without capitalism.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's been a constant struggle and that we're still learning about is our distribution methods. When we were distributing masks, we were working really closely with TANC, Tenant and Neighborhood Councils, which is our local tenant union, incredibly radical and wonderful organization. And I think it made sense to work with something that we thought people would have a inherent base in, right? We're asking folks to join an organization that will help them if they are having issues with their rent, having issues with their landlord, rather than something abstract that has nothing to do with material conditions that they're facing.
Yeah.
And we weren't super successful in that. And that was really disappointing. And so, we looked at that and we started to change our distribution. And for the air purifiers, instead of working as closely with TANC, that we still did and we still do, and we're working to use the air purifiers to now actually kind of organize buildings that are starting to be organized, and using these goods as a way to kind of build trust and open a broader conversation.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and I think in this kind of like building trust, opening that conversation with an air purifier, with a mask, we started asking folks to come out to our air purifier distribution. And we finally actually did have some folks come out, which was really exciting, though I think we still have a lot of room to grow. And one of the things that we learned during this, and that we're starting to explore more, is that it seems like, churches have that community kind of already in place, and they're already oftentimes, at least some sects, are thinking about charity work and are thinking about how to help folks. And that has been a really nice way to kind of ask people to come out. And so we're now looking more to kind of work with churches and work with those types of organizations that already have some basis for what we're doing, where I think it's maybe easier for people to come out, though we're still learning, I think, how to actually realize mutual aid and how to make it possible within capitalism, which I think is really hard when capitalism kind of squashes any creativity and free time that anyone has to do this work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not just that, but also like all capitalist education does not really want to encourage you to build dual power and move away from capitalism, does it? Like the resources aren't necessarily there to teach you. But you did mention you do readings in your groups, and that's really cool and really interesting. So like you're going and getting that education for yourself. Could you tell me more about that? And also, like, I'm curious if there is something that drives what you read, and like what topics or what books you're reading and discussing.
Yeah, totally. And I think just going back on that question a little bit, I also just wanted to say, through this process, I think, Abrar, who started this organization, and myself as well, and I would imagine, Joe, though I'll let you speak for yourself, like our politics have shifted dramatically. I think, Abrar, coming out of, the Bernie days, started doing this work and very quickly felt frustrated with electoralism, and very quickly shifted to wanting to, come at it from a different perspective. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Joe.
No. That's great. I can start the readings question if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sure. So we do a lot of readings. I think it's really important to study the world and have an analysis of power and a theory of how to change things. And we think, that theory is only useful insofar as it shapes your actions, just as your actions are only useful insofar as they're shaped by theory. So like during our weekly organizer meetings, we'll often have a reading. And for instance, one of my favorite essays is from a book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. And it's an essay by Ruth Wilson Gilmore called In the Shadow of the Shadow State. And it's about the nonprofit industrial complex. Highly recommend. But we've read all sorts of stuff. And I think like forging a shared ideology is really important for cohering a group.
Definitely. I think, you asked how we did these readings and how we chose what to read.
Yeah.
I think some of the ways was really when we were doing the mask build, looking around and seeing, what isn't being read elsewhere in DSA or elsewhere in these kind of groups that we're organizing in, and what do people in the group that we're working with want to read. And kind of taking it from there. There were folks that were really interested in learning more about Paris 1968. And so we did a series on that. We did a 3-part series on Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution, where we had like PowerPoint slides and presentations and discussions
Wow.
to make it as accessible as possible for, again, everybody to participate in. And again, in that kind of community spirit, messaging people in the chat who aren't participating, asking them what their thoughts are, trying to engage everybody on some level. We read Pannekoek in contrast to Jane McAlevey and talked about different types of unionizing theories and practices. And I think having those discussions was really powerful because, again, I wasn't necessarily seeing these things happen in other leftist circles that I was closely around. We also, I kind of mentioned as the mask build was winding down, we didn't want to lose this community. It felt to me really powerful and important, and we were kind of trying to figure out what do we do in this period of time. And so we all voted on different books that had been chosen, and we decided to read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. And I think that was a really powerful book group and led to a lot of really incredible discussions.
Yeah, awesome. Well, so Joe, you said that you think that building a kind of coherent ideology is important for a group. And I think that a lot of ideology and theory discussions really dominate the online left space that I'm in. And I know that a lot of my audience certainly kind of have... Okay, let's make up a guy and explain something to him. We're imagining a viewer who really wants to get involved with CHC, but they're a little concerned that they might have to work with people who they don't really see eye to eye with ideologically. And sorry, I've been talking to Joe, but this is obviously open to either of you. What would you say to someone who is kind of worried about having to organize with people who they don't see eye to eye with, both on a broader sort of sense, maybe you're a socialist and you're talking about having to be around liberals, and what if they talk to me about markets or something? But also if you're an anarchist and you got to work with Marxist-Leninists, something like this.
I can comment. Yeah, that's a really real question. I think our stance is welcome everyone, especially welcome in people who maybe aren't politicized or consider themselves liberals. I think that doing the work itself is the most powerful way to politicize people, and if our politics are so great, we should be able to convince people, especially through our actions. And with regards to the factionalism within the left, we have a pretty wide ideological spectrum within CHC. And I think it's ultimately a strength because people bring different ideas to the table, different theories of what we should be doing and how to go about it. What do you think, Janine?
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that answer. And I think, it is challenging. We've had, people come up to us and talk to us about, partnering with certain organizations that everyone kind of cringes, and it's how do you respond to this? And everyone kind of looks at each other. And I also think, we've developed relationships with really incredible people who maybe are more liberal and are starting to find their footing in more radical politics. Myself and Abrar recently got dinner with one of these folks, and we were talking to her, and she was kind of I've always felt a little weird about electoralism, but I don't really know why, and I don't really understand it. And what do you all think? And it was a really wonderful conversation to be able to talk with her about the limits that we saw in electoralism, and for her to just be oh my gosh, yes, you're naming all of these things that I had kind of felt but didn't have words for. And, I remember her coming onto these mask building calls about a year ago saying I don't know what this socialism thing is, but I'm curious about it. And she's become a dear friend and a really wonderful person. And I should also mention that she's quite a bit older than I am, and I feel I've learned so much from her in so many ways as well. And there are other folks like this. I think, it can be difficult to welcome in people with different ideologies, and I think at times it can make organizing slower. And I also think it's important to have those people come in and help out. And I would also say, Joe and I have different politics, and we're also really close friends, and we're also able to organize together and talk about those differences and figure out ways to organize that we both feel really excited about.
We still get in fights, though.
Oh, of course. Are you even leftists if you don't get in fights? So- okay, well, I think this is an interesting question that I've got down here. Can you tell me about your inspirations for what you do?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Do you want to go first or me, Janine?
Go for it, Joe.
Okay. There are so many, and we can't cover them all, but I'll mention there's a group called the Common Ground Collective, which kind of
Definitely an inspiration then.
we echo their name. They were founded in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and they brought together thousands and thousands of volunteers, organized healthcare centers, and brought lots of essential resources in before the government or Red Cross or anyone even showed up. So they're great. And here we are in Oakland, California, in the East Bay. You can't talk about mutual aid without talking about the Black Panther Party, who had dozens of what they called survival programs, from like ambulance services to escorting seniors. And of course, the Free Breakfast for Children program is perhaps the most famous example of mutual aid in the world.
Yeah.
What I love about the Panthers is that they understood that like we need to organize to help people survive, but survival programs organized by busy working people are trivial in comparison to the capacities of the full might and power of the U.S. ruling class. So they would say survival pending revolution. We can't just stop at these services. We have to build independent working class power, organization, build up these like democratic forces which can threaten power and ultimately win popular demands. So the FBI director Hoover called the Panthers the greatest internal security threat to the country. But ultimately their work pressured the government into amending the Child Nutrition Act and eventually establishing the government school breakfast program as a permanent service. So I think through them we see like how mutual aid can push more systemic demands. They're a big inspiration to me.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, I came into this work on kind of the tails of the George Floyd protests. And while I had been a prison abolitionist prior to that, was diving much deeper into the theory during that time and reading a lot about it. And I think the prison abolition movement, to me, is a big inspiration. And we, talked about Angela Davis's Our Prisons Obsolete during our mask builds and had a 2-part series on abolition. I think mutual aid is inherently abolitionist. I think community building is essential to creating a world that doesn't have the prison industrial complex. As I was thinking about how do we get to a world without prison abolition, which feels like a big question, I think to me, one of the essential things is giving people the resources that they need to survive and allowing them to have a community that they can rely on. And I think when they don't have those things, it's easy to be pushed into a circumstance where people are forced to commit crimes. Yeah. Obviously, it's not as black and white as this. I know there are a lot of gray areas here, but I think that that's a huge piece to moving forward. And so I see the work that we're doing as, inherently abolitionist and as kind of moving towards a world without prisons and the prison industrial complex. I also think Spain is a huge inspiration to a lot of us. I think, the 80 years that led up to the revolution, during that time, mutual aid was a huge part of what was happening. And I think that really led to that revolution being much more egalitarian in character instead of, I think, a lot of revolutions that really kind of turned authoritarian in character. And I think mutual aid was a huge piece of that. And I've also been reading this book, The Free Women of Spain, about the Mujeres Libres movement, which I think for me has been really powerful and inspiring, especially working in leftist spaces with a lot of men, to read about women doing really incredible things, and kind of seeing a lot of these things that I've felt but haven't had words for, and realizing that, this community aspect isn't just like soft liberal love. It actually has basis in like revolutionary praxis. Yeah. And that, these women were really conscious of the fact that there were a lot of people that weren't able to work, whether that was because of, having children, whether that was because they were children or other disabilities, being able to organize around community and not just around the workplace was oftentimes actually more effective for them. And I think that, in that way, community building was really powerful. They also talk about being able to find equality through one being able to be themselves, and someone is only able to be themselves if they have a true community, if they're able to feel that around them and actualize their full potential through that. And that was one of the ways that they saw a path towards equality. And I think that that's a really powerful and kind of incredible thought.
I really like that. That's really, really nice. Yeah.
Yeah, they also had these free childcare services that they would kind of bring around. And in doing so, they would kind of propagandize people. So, women would bring their children, and when they came to pick them up, they would have, readings and teachings. And reading this, I was like, this is obviously very different, but kind of similar to our distributions, right? You're providing a service, and you're using that as a way to build trust and open up a conversation to try and bring people into the work that you're doing, and to try and emphasize the importance of these types of anarchist communities, and realizing that the systems that we currently have are not working. I think another place that I've really drawn inspiration from is Dual Power. And I was reading the Dual Power statement this morning that's written by the Libertarian Socialist Caucus. And this one quote, "We believe our current projects and pursuits must mirror, and in mirroring become, the world we want to emerge from the ashes of capitalism. In short, our method consists of embodying the world we dare to dream." And I think that really resonated with me. I think, Common Humanity Collective is in some ways a small world that I dare to dream of. I think, we have a lot of care and community and solidarity amongst our organizers in a way that I don't often see in leftist spaces. I know when I've had difficult weeks because of work, because of, personal life or other things, people have reached out to me and offered to bring me food, and vice versa. And I think that there is this deep care and solidarity within our organization that is really powerful, and that keeps people coming back, and that people actually want to be a part of, because it's not just siloed folks that are kind of doing work. I once saw a tweet from someone about, how organizing shouldn't be a place to make friends. It should be a place to do work. And I just was filled with rage. I was like, no.
Well, that's what tweets are for. The tweets are meant to fill you with rage. That's why you got to stay off Twitter.
That's fair. And I think I maybe understand where they're coming from, but I also think life sucks in a lot of ways. Capitalism is pretty awful.
Yeah,
and what are we doing if organizing is just another place where we're individually siloed doing work? Organizing is hard, and I don't want to diminish that at all. The work that we do is exhausting and difficult and draining, but it's also fulfilling and beautiful, and a way to build connections and friendships and solidarity that I think is vitally important.
Absolutely. I mean, alienation isn't just a byproduct of our economic mode. It's actually a crucial pillar of capitalism, and they wouldn't fight so hard to alienate us if, frankly, like you said, community is inherently abolitionist, right? Just working together, we can change things by the simple act of working together itself. I think I hope our imaginary viewer has been thoroughly convinced and has been inspired by all the inspirations. But now, to get less hypothetical, I do know something my audience actually do care about is, two things: inclusivity and accessibility. And I try to ask every person or people that I interview this, what does CHC do to ensure that marginalized people feel safe in their space? And as a follow-up, what do you do for people who have disabilities, or they have, say, a full-time job or kids and other restrictions on their capacity? So how do you make it inclusive, and how do you make it accessible?
Yeah. I think as a very small example of this, I have a chronic illness and was originally drawn to this group because I saw a group of people that were being really cautious about COVID. And I moved to the Bay Area right as the pandemic hit, only knowing one person, and being really, really afraid to get COVID because of my chronic illness. And being able to go to mask builds where everyone was wearing a high filtration mask, it was outside and people were distanced, was a huge relief in being like, oh my gosh, there is a place I can go to maybe meet some people and do exciting work in a way that feels safe. And I think we've really tried to continue that at our air purifier builds. And we had a mask build yesterday. We've required everyone to wear high filtration masks so that people feel comfortable. On our RSVP form for these builds, we've asked, if you've come to a previous one, have you felt safe from COVID? On this form, we also have a question about, this is kind of what the space is. This is how accessible things are. Are your access needs met? And trying to, find out, right? If someone's access needs aren't met, what can we do to try and help with that? We have chairs at these events so that, folks can sit down and, ideally not have to ask for a chair, right? That there's just enough chairs that if someone needs that, they're able to access that. And, we've had people come up to us being like, hey, I have this injury or that injury, what work is good for me based on, my inability to do X thing. And we're always really happy to work with folks and encourage people to take breaks, when we were doing the air purifier builds in like the hot summer days, right? It's like we had food and we had water and we had, a place for people to be in the shade and kind of chill out for a little bit. I also think that the work we're doing is inherently trying to slow a mass disabling event. I've been deeply horrified by the response from the US government for COVID this whole time, but especially recently. Yep. Watching our healthcare systems and our schools completely collapse is horrifying. And I think we're doing, a small part in trying to slow this. We're doing a small part in trying to ease anxiety by giving people high filtration masks. I have no doubt at this point that our masks have actually saved lives. And I think that, just being able to help slow the spread of COVID is a huge part of this. And similarly, the air purifiers, we've distributed them to countless people who have asthma and other respiratory illnesses. Who do need some type of air filtration system, especially during these smoky months, but also literally just in West Oakland, where there's a lot of pollution from highways and from factories in that area. The asthma rates are really high, and poverty is also pretty high, and that's one of the areas we focused our distribution because of those issues. I also think community building is an aspect of this, creating a space where people can feel comfortable regardless of where they're coming from, and feel like they have a voice in the work that we're doing and can, stand up for what they want to see change and happen. And we're all trying to hold ourselves accountable to that as well, and, not putting the burden on someone else. We've also worked to have childcare at our air purifier events. In full honesty, it didn't happen because we never had enough kids come. The kids that did came kind of helped build the air purifiers, which was really exciting. And I think we can do a better job of advertising that moving forward and kind of working on that. But I think we are constantly thinking about trying to be accessible to as many people as possible. Like I mentioned, we had a mask build yesterday, and someone wasn't able to come to it because of their inability to drive. And so I'm going to drive a kit to them later today so that they're able to still participate and build masks and feel like they're a part of this group, which they very, very much are. So I think, I really appreciate the question because I think it is a really important thing to think about. And I think, we are thinking about how we can make this as accessible as possible to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Joe, do you have anything to add, perhaps on the other side of ensuring marginalized people feel safe in the space as well?
I think Janine's answer was beautiful. A short comment I guess I'll add is one of the values of incorporating mutual aid into any leftist movement and project is its accessibility. And part of that is that you can do it from home, or depending on the project. Like, there's a lot of ways to work people in, and you're able to choose how much you want to put into this, which is a big deal. A lot of people come into like DSA and they don't have the training to knock doors, or they don't have the experience. But anyone can show up and build air purifiers if we have instructions for them. And when you empower someone, show them that they can make a difference in their community, like by physically building something, it's a smaller step to like then knocking on doors and then talking to your coworkers and to organize a union. So I think it's important to do this work always.
Yeah.
I would really agree. And I just want to add on to that. I think, mutual aid is, in at least the way we're doing it, is more accessible than door knocking, because you're not, walking upstairs. And like, I know for me personally, that was something that like just hasn't always been within my ability to do. And having something that is a little bit less physically demanding for me personally has been really, really wonderful. I would also say, a lot of us are working really demanding jobs. A lot of us are, struggling with mental health issues. And I think despite all of those things, we have built a really amazing collective where people are able to join regardless of these, like, I don't even know. It's wild to me. We have, PhD students, people working over 50 hours a week,
Wow.
Folks that are struggling in various ways, people applying to medical school, like the whole swath of really amazing people that are doing so much outside of just the work that they're doing here. I think it's remarkable that we've been able to achieve what we have.
People are, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off,
No,
but
go ahead.
I feel like people are really alone in this country. I've personally felt very alone many times in my life, and having a community of like-minded people building stuff together and caring for each other just makes a world of difference.
Yeah, that's really good answers. So I would like to ask now about the future. What does the future hold for CHC? What do you hope to achieve? And what's the long-term plan look like?
Yeah, I think right now we are kind of in this interesting space of, we finished our air purifiers. COVID is really bad, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But there was a period of time where we had finished our air purifiers and COVID wasn't terrible. And so it was like, what do we do next? And how do we figure out what to do next? And what do we have the capacity and ability to do? And so, we all came together and, over a full day, talked about what are some of our options, what are some of the things that we think we can build, and what are some of the issues that we think people are experiencing. And we turned that into a survey of sorts that asks about, heat exposure and cold. And we've heard that mold is a really big issue in the Bay Area for some folks, and, breathing in really awful mold, having their bathrooms covered in mold, things like that. Asking questions about COVID safety, these types of things that then we think we are able to kind of build products or things to be able to provide to these folks. And so we have some air purifiers left. And as I mentioned, we've been targeting West Oakland, and we've been distributing these air purifiers there because air quality is really bad year round. And as we're distributing air purifiers and masks, we've been asking people, what are some of the main issues that you're experiencing? Of these things that we think we might be able to produce, which one would be most useful to you? And using the air purifiers, again, as a way to kind of open up that relationship and then kind of talk more with them and start to build a deeper relationship with these people. And at this point, some of these folks in West Oakland we know pretty well, and have developed a good relationship with. And I feel really excited to kind of continue working with them. And I think that this survey will serve as a way to figure out, what we can build next. And I also think we're building these relationships to mobilize in times of crisis. And that's always been a goal for me for CHC. And I think, we just did this yesterday, right? Omicron is, like I mentioned, terrible. In California, our governor, Gavin Newsom, just signed an order saying that if a healthcare worker tests positive for COVID, but they're asymptomatic, that they can still go to work. Our local school system has been having sick outs. I was on a call with some high schoolers from our public schools that were talking about how horrified they are. I've been talking to teachers that work in the public school system about how empty their classes are. Things are in major crisis. This is horrifying to watch and to be a part of. And so CHC mobilized. We were like, we still have supplies, right? We have a network of people that we can call on that will build these masks. And so on a cold day in winter, cold for California, I'll preface, it's not that cold. And on a 3-day weekend, we were able to get, I think, upwards of 40 people to come out yesterday with a week's notice to build masks and to help distribute them to their friends and family. And we're starting to build these connections also in West Oakland and with, food banks that we've worked with so that when disaster strikes, we can mobilize. And I think for me, seeing the heat waves over the summer in the Pacific Northwest that killed upwards of 800 people, watching Texas freeze over, I believe that was about a year ago now. And most of the discourse that I saw was really about the only way people were staying alive was through mutual aid and through community and connections. I think it's really clear that that rich people are not going to step in and help. They're going to be fine in their mansions and their air conditioned or heated, giant spaces. And the rest of us really have to fend for ourselves. And I think CHC is doing that and building a community of folks that we can call on in an instant to be able to come together and to be able to care for people and ensure that, we can do what we can to try and help folks. I think kind of broadening out as far as our goals, continuing to try and make our distribution truly mutual aid, continuing to evaluate, at this point, Abrara and I and some other folks yesterday were talking about how when we do distributions, oftentimes we know it will be a failure. And it's more about what can we learn from this, right? Every distribution is a huge learning opportunity to trying to understand how we can do mutual aid, whether or not that's possible in capitalism, but at least getting as close to mutual aid as we can with, the resources that we have.
Yeah.
And I think, creating dual power institutions, like I mentioned, providing immediate needs and seizing control of production, building communal spaces. I know there's talk about starting to write some of our own literature and theory, and I'm really, really excited about that. I think that that's hugely valuable to the work that we're doing. And I think, I had messaged one of our co-organizers, Tim, prior to this call with this question being what would you add? And I think his response was something along the lines of, build cool stuff and spread it across the U.S. And
that's a good
it
answer.
sounds,
Yeah.
it sounds funny, and I think it's also again, this building is hugely political and hugely rooted in the work that we're doing, being able to make cool shit and come together around that. Actualizing, what Marx talks about the kind of community and solidarity of a factory floor, and building that community and solidarity through building goods and services that people need, and hopefully, continuing to help other folks start these projects as well. Joe, what do you have to add?
That was great.
Well, I agree. Let's go back to our hypothetical viewer. They were very won over. They're no longer worried about having to work with people they disagree with. In fact, they live in Oakland, East Bay area. What are the other areas you said you were around?
Oakland, Berkeley, Emeryville, the whole East Bay, San Leandro.
Okay.
We work a little bit. Yeah, sorry. We work a little bit with San Francisco, and we also sent air purifiers to Reno, and some other folks in those areas where the AQI over the summer was 500, which is, orange skies, very little sunlight, and a horrifying experience.
Oof. Right. So a hypothetical viewer, they're in the East Bay area, and they've decided, hey, I want to get involved with CHC. Or they're further afield. Maybe they're in another part of the US. Maybe they're here in cursed Turf Island, or they're in another country entirely. So I guess the two questions to ask are, how does our viewer in East Bay get involved with CHC today? And how does our viewer somewhere else do their own CHC? That's what they decided they want to do.
Great question. If you are in the East Bay, you should go to our website, commonhumanitycollective.org. Hit the Get Involved button and sign up, and one of us, probably me or Janine, will call you. We love bringing new people in. It is such a thrilling thing to have new people in this process. If you aren't nearby, but you want to reproduce one of our projects, you want to make your own masks or your own purifiers, we have the designs up in detail on our website. with the specs, the costs, the manufacturers. So we tried to make it really easy to reproduce. And I mean, I think it's pretty easy to start your own mutual aid project. You just get a couple friends together. You don't have to do our design. Make sandwiches for people, or join your local leftist organization and try and bring mutual aid into their process. I think that we have this saying in the U.S. An unorganized socialist is a contradiction in terms. So like, get involved, do stuff. That's what makes it real. I'll comment also, like, we are happy to talk to people who aren't nearby if they want advice. We really love supporting people. A few weeks ago, we were contacted by some folks in Syracuse in New York who are in a DSA chapter over there, and they were really excited by our work and wanted to reproduce it. So we just put together this big kit for them. It supplies to produce 800 masks, and I've got the box down in my basement, and we're going to send it over, and we're just thrilled by this opportunity.
That's so cool. That's incredible.
Yeah, I would add, after Abrar and I did the It Could Happen Here podcast, we had folks reach out from a variety of non-local areas. And it was really exciting to talk with folks. We spent more than an hour talking to someone in Arizona who wanted to start their project, just about like what they wanted to do, what pitfalls we had run into. And I think, Joe and myself and the other incredible organizers on our team are really excited to take the time to just talk with people about what we've experienced and share any resources and knowledge that we have and can share. I think, that's what this work is about, right? Building community, building connections. And I don't think mutual aid always has to look like the exchange of goods. I think it can also be the exchange of ideas. And we're happy to do that with folks.
Cool. Hell yeah. Well, you said about informing people about the pitfalls, and that's actually what the next question's about, because our viewer, hypothetical though they are, is either getting on the website right now, link in the description, they're clicking through, they're doing all the stuff, or they're probably also getting in touch because they want to get your advice. But like, before they even do that, are there pitfalls they can watch out for? In other words, what mistakes are common? What are they gonna run into in the early days?
I'll start. I think that there's this debate on the left, charity versus mutual aid. And in some ways, I think it's a little reductive. I think that a lot of people who are starting their mutual aid projects are going to be doing just simple service work. They're going to be like making goods and giving them to people. And some people would call that charity. I think that work is really valuable, and we need to help people survive. This is a really tough world. And I think it's a base to build from. You start out giving stuff to people, then you start talking to people. You start building community and relationships, and you can advance into like more advanced forms of mutual aid where you're really organizing and building independent power.
Definitely. I think, distribution is a huge pitfall of this work, I think. I also think, doing work and giving people things that they need is not inherently bad. And I do not mean to comment in a way that makes people who are doing that work feel bad. I think it's incredibly necessary. I think we constantly have to hold system change and immediate need together, because we can't let people die along the way. And we also have to fight for a better world. That being said, I think our goal is really to, make our distribution truly mutual aid, have there be a reciprocal relationship. And I think that, as we've talked about on this call already, is incredibly difficult. And I don't think we have a clear answer. I'm not sure anyone does. If you do, please reach out and let us know, because we're struggling. But I think, experimenting and learning from mistakes and, not seeing success and failure as such binaries, but understanding the gray areas between those things, and that, success can just be learning from something. Success can be, one person from a distribution showing up to an event, celebrating the small things and learning from and growing from them, and always challenging ourselves. And I think, like Joe mentioned, building community. I had someone yesterday at this mask build that we did come up to me and say, I've been really isolated because I'm really worried about getting COVID, and it's been so nice just to be around people again. I received texts from people this morning expressing how much fun they had yesterday, just being able to be around people. I know I felt like a happiness that felt more genuine than it has in a long time after our build. I think, I guess the pitfall in this is not actualizing that community. And I think you can. I think it's really about caring for people, building those human interactions that allow people to keep coming back. I also think, we've kind of touched on this already, but making stuff is really essential to this project. Having a space where we're building something, where that community is being built, that solidarity is being felt. People are, able to create a really incredible product without, kind of outside of the limits of capitalism, right? It's constantly the saying, capitalism breeds innovation, but here we're breeding innovation in a non-capitalist way, right? And we're able to make really incredible things. And so I would encourage people, if they are interested in doing something similar to what we're doing, to rely heavily on that building aspect and on building community through that building aspect. I think, again, mutual aid is really difficult, and we're happy to chat with folks. And I think, we haven't figured it out. I by no means mean to say that we know what we're doing, because we have no idea, but we've learned a lot, and we have a lot of really incredible people to rely on and to challenge us and to constantly think, after our distributions, after our builds, we oftentimes hang out. And I think, in those hangouts, there's spaces to go to just decompress and talk about other things. There's spaces to go to talk about theory and really intense political theory. And there's also spaces to go where people are talking about, what went well, what didn't go well, how can we do better next time, what resources can we provide. I think we're constantly challenging ourselves to do better and to learn from our mistakes. And I think people are challenging us. And I think we always really appreciate, especially the folks who are challenging us, who have come out and, participated in our work.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you for joining me for this episode of Organizing Interviews. Before we head off, anything at all you want to shout out? It could just be an idea. It could be another organization you think is neat. Your own personal project. Literally anything. Platform's yours. Go ahead.
Well, you should follow us on social media at CHumanityC. That's the letter C, then humanity, then the letter C, on Instagram and Twitter. If you want to support our work but you're not local, there's a donate button on our website. And definitely show up, call us. We're so happy to support and have your support. And make cool shit and read books. That's all I have to say.
Great.
I second Joe, and I would just say a huge plug and shout out to all the organizers who aren't on this call, who make CHC happen and who it would not run without. And also just a plug to some of our really incredible partners in organizing, Sunrise, which is a group focusing on getting a Green New Deal passed through Congress, has been an incredible partner. As I mentioned, Tank, tenant and neighborhood councils. We've worked with indigenous land trusts like Segurate Land Trusts. We've worked with Critical Resistance, which is an amazing abolitionist organization founded by Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis. Mask Oakland, Berkeley Mutual Aid. These are all really amazing groups that I think, we would not be where we are today without our partnerships with them. Joe, do you have others to add? I know I'm forgetting many.
We gotta mention DSA.
There you go. Okay, well, thank you for joining me, Joe and Janine. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? They say in Harlan County there are no neutrals there. You'll either be a Union man or a thug for J.H. Blair.